Hello, my name is James Stacey. I'm a clinical psychologist in the Oxfordshire CAMS Neurodevelopmental Conditions pathway. This video is part of the NDC Pathways Pre-Assessment Parent Intervention and is on emotional regulation. There are 3 other videos in this series, one on anxiety, one on self-harm, and one on aggression. There is also a workbook which goes with this video or presentation, and we'd encourage you to work through it so that you can apply the ideas that this presentation introduces you to your own child. There are 3 main aims of this presentation. The first is to consider the impact of emotional regulation problems on children and young people and also their parents. The next is to demonstrate how we can understand emotional regulation difficulties in children and young people. And finally, and perhaps most importantly for some of you, it is to give you ideas about how to help with emotional regulation problems. This presentation has 6 parts. I'll begin by talking with you about the impacts of emotional dysregulation on children and young people and their parents. We'll think about what it's like for children who struggle with emotional regulation and what it's like for their parents. I'll then encourage you to think about some goals, what you want to achieve by watching this video, completing the workbook and applying the ideas. We'll then move on to thinking about how we can understand emotional regulation problems before thinking about strategies and skills that you as parents can use and that you can teach your child to help with emotional regulation difficulties. So, moving on to the impact of emotional dysregulation. Of course, all children and young people have intense emotional reactions from time to time. So how do children with emotional dysregulation problems differ? Well, Harvey and Penzo say that a child who is emotionally dysregulated reacts intensely and immediately to situations or circumstances that others may not react to and has a hard time returning to their emotional state. Just take a moment to see if this definition of emotional dysregulation applies to your child. There are some more questions on the next slide which might help you to think about this. So these questions are, does your child go from 0 to 100 in an instant? Are strong emotions very easily triggered? Does your child take a long time to recover? And does this happen a lot? If the answer to these questions is yes, then it's likely that your child is suffering with significant emotional regulation problems. We know that problems with emotional regulation are associated with a number of other difficulties, including aggression, self-harm, guilt and shame, relational problems, and difficulties with peers. There are a number of other effects of emotional dysregulation. Harvey and Penzo suggest that emotional dysregulation gets in the way of learning, particularly around learning certain new behaviours, gets in the way of maintaining expected behaviours, and that's often when children or young people know what they're supposed to be doing, but the dysregulation stops them from doing that. And relatedly, it stops them from responding to parental limits. Children and young people's emotional dysregulation has a huge impact on parents' well-being and their emotional states. Parents of children and young people who experience emotional dysregulation describe feeling frightened, exhausted, and overwhelmed. They also describe feeling guilty about not being able to do more for their child's emotional dysregulation. They feel judged by others who see their child behaving in a particular way and feel that parents should be managing that. And they also feel hopeless because they've often tried many things and things haven't really made much difference. I really want you to know that in the NDC service, we truly believe that your child's emotional dysregulation is neither your fault nor their fault. We know that this is a major challenge, but we also believe there are lots of things which can help, and indeed that there's always hope. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to pause the video and spend a few minutes thinking about what you really want to get, or what you want to achieve in terms of your child's emotional regulation. I want you to think what you want to get from watching this video, from completing the workbook, from applying the ideas, and from attending the question and answer session. You can use the associated workbook if you want to formally complete this exercise, as there's a page in there all about creating some goals. So the key question for you to consider is, what do you want in relation to emotional regulation for your child and for you? Please now pause the video and take a few minutes to think about what you really want to achieve. So we're going to move on to understanding emotional dysregulation now. There are a number of different ways in which we can understand emotional dysregulation. We find that the story of emotion is a really helpful way to try and understand a child's emotional dysregulation difficulties. The first step is to consider what a child's vulnerabilities or risk factors are. This might include communication challenges that they've experienced their whole life, or traumatic events they've experienced. We also want to understand their slow triggers. These are things which don't happen immediately before emotional dysregulation, but occur in the build-up and may contribute to them struggling with their emotions. So this would include things like tiredness, hunger, ongoing learning or peer problems in school. We then want to think about what the child or young person's fast triggers are. So that is things which happen just before the emotional dysregulation occurs. This might include things like someone saying no or something breaking. What typically happens when a child or young person experiences a fast trigger is that they will have a thought, a reactive thought about the situation or event. For example, they might think it's unfair, or they shouldn't say that. This typically then leads to a response in their bodies. It might be that their heart rate increases significantly. It might be that they get very tense in their body or clench their fists, or get very hot and sweaty. And then you get the experience of emotion, which we might label as something like anger in this situation. And of course, following the emotion, we get the behaviours and actions, which might be things like shouting or punching, or even a young person harming themselves. Of course, our aim is to change the outcome of the story for the young person, and it's going to be easiest to do this if we can intervene earlier in this story. One thing to consider when you're beginning to think about your child's story of emotion is your own story of emotion. We all have one, and we all have vulnerabilities or risk factors which will make it more likely that we will struggle with our emotions. So think about your child's story of emotion and your own story of emotion in parallel. So I'd like to say a little bit now about how children and young people with autism and ADHD are more likely to experience problems with emotional regulation. So autistic children and young people and children with ADHD show differences to other young people in a number of ways. At a very basic level, children with autism and children with ADHD show differences in their brain. We know that in terms of the brain circuitry and brain neurochemistry, there are differences which make it more likely that children with ADHD or autism will show problems with emotional regulation. We also know that neurodivergent young people show social differences in how they are able to communicate and interact. And of course, that leads to different responses from other children and young people. And if those experiences are difficult, that will increase the likelihood of emotional dysregulation. We also know that emotional regulation is a skill. It's not something we're born with. Many children and young people learn that skill naturally without ever being formally taught it. Now, for children with autism or ADHD, this may be a lot more difficult, and we really need to tune into their learning styles and differences in order to help them develop these skills. We also know that children with autism and ADHD often have difficulties recognizing and understanding emotions. Now, if you can't tune into your emotions and recognize them, then it's going to be very difficult to manage them. So one of the tasks that we may need to complete for an autistic child or a child with ADHD is to help them better understand what's going on emotionally for them. Many autistic children and children with ADHD also experience sensory differences. Many of these children experienced heightened sensory reactions to things which are going on around them. This might be things they hear, it might be things they see, it might be things they touch. If you are more sensitive to things which are going on around you, then you're more likely to have an emotional reaction to that as well, which would increase the likelihood of emotional regulation problems. Finally, we know that many autistic children, young people, and children with ADHD also have different soothing preferences to typically developing children. If we don't know what their soothing preferences are, then we may not be able to support them to use those things when they need them most. That is when they're struggling with emotional dysregulation. Okay, so let's move on to adult focused strategies. The first thing to say is that supporting a child who has emotional dysregulation problems is incredibly challenging, and the thing that you must first do is to regulate yourself. It's really important that you take a moment to do what you need to do to get yourself into the right state to face the challenge of supporting your dysregulated child. There are short-term and long-term goals in supporting a child who is emotionally dysregulated. The short-term goal is to calm the child as quickly as possible when they're dysregulated. The long-term goal is to identify ways to prevent the child from becoming dysregulated. So in terms of short-term goals, there are a number of strategies which we would strongly encourage you to use. The first, as I've mentioned already, is to intervene as early as possible. So if we remember the story of emotion, if we think back to that and think, actually, where is the earliest point it's possible to intervene for a child? Is it where they are facing triggers, where they're beginning to get dysregulated? If so, then that's where we want to put our energy into supporting them so that it doesn't turn into a full-blown dysregulation. Another really important strategy is to know your own triggers and plan how you will respond. Parents of dysregulated children will often describe how in those moments of high distress, the child will press their buttons. They will say things and do things which are incredibly painful and challenging for the parent. And the key is to identify what those things are and to have a plan in mind for what you're going to do when that happens. And we talk about responding wisely when we do that. So it's acknowledging one's own emotions, but also thinking about what is going to be most helpful for you in that and your child in that moment. It may seem obvious, but a really key strategy in helping your child, when they're dysregulated, is to slow down, take a step back, keep calm, and back off if you can't keep calm, and soothe your child in a way that works for them. I'll say more about that a little later on in the presentation. So some other strategies that will help with the short-term goal of calming your child as quickly as possible. First, it's crucial that you validate the underlying emotion and your child's experience. This is always at the heart of good practice around emotional dysregulation. Whether the cause of the dysregulation was minimal or you don't agree that it was right that the child responded in that way because it seemed like it wasn't a big deal, the emotion that your child will experience in that moment is absolutely real, and you have to get alongside it and validate it and acknowledge it. And alongside that, we must offer hope using a message such as "we can do this." And of course, I don't really need to say this to you, but in these moments of high stress or anxiety, it's crucial that we don't blame, we don't criticise, we don't threaten or take things away. None of us react well when we're emotionally distressed to threats or criticism or blame. It's much more likely to lead to an escalation in the behaviour. It may be that when things have settled, if something particularly bad has happened, you may need to think with your child about how they learn from what happened. But learning is not going to occur in that moment of high distress when there's blame, criticism, threats, or things being taken away. And finally, it's also crucial that we help a child learn to ride the wave of emotion, and that means sticking with the emotion and just being with it until they come through it. Often it's the fight to get rid of that emotion that creates more problems and escalates things. Whilst we're doing that, we may wish to guide them to their calming strategies, which I will introduce in later slides. So moving on to longer term goals, there are a number of really important things to consider. The first is that you have to remember that you and your child or young person are doing the best you can. This is essential. You have to be kind to yourselves and recognise that this is one of life's major challenges, and you will certainly be trying to do the best you possibly can. Alongside that, however, you can also learn new skills, as can your child, that will help with this really significant challenge. Again, I've already mentioned this, but it's really crucial that as this preventative strategy, you really develop your understanding of your child's story of emotion, and it will evolve and change over time. So keep coming back to it and review it and check it and get other people's views, things that can be added into that story. And again, just validate, validate, validate. Your child's emotional experiences will always be understandable if you go back to this story. Something else to consider is around your own thinking. It's important that we consider the helpfulness of judgments, appraisals, or evaluations of your child's emotions and associated behaviours. Whilst we can't control the kinds of thoughts which come into our mind, and it's understandable that in moments of upset or in the aftermath of that, parents might think, this is unfair, the child shouldn't be doing this, or something similar. Actually, what we can do is reflect on the helpfulness of that thought, because if you buy into that thought, then that will generate further concern and negativity, and may contribute to your child showing further behaviour. Whereas if you can step back from it and recognise that actually that might not be more helpful, it might be more helpful to move your thinking to a different place, then hopefully that can help to keep calm over a longer period of time. Okay, so some other longer term strategies. So again, this seems very simple, but is a very, very challenging skill to master. So what we'd encourage you to do is to develop your ability to respond wisely rather than reacting. And there are lots of ways to do this. So mindfulness would be a well-known example. It helps us to slow down and think before reacting. But other strategies, such as knowing that you can be both flexible, for example, compromising in some situations, and firm, for example, maintaining a clear boundary on something of major importance, is another way to develop this wise response rather than this reactive response. Next, we also want to think about how we can develop your child's understanding of others' emotions and their emotions and the skills to manage them. And again, we'll say more about that in the following slides. Finally, please remember that it takes real time to develop yours and your child's skills in this area, and that change won't happen overnight. You will need to practice, 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 and there'll be a lot of trial and error in developing strategies, both for yourself and for your child. So moving on to child-focused strategies, there are two key aims or tasks in terms of the children or young people strategies. The first is how we can help them to understand their emotions, and the second is how we can help them to develop and practice calming skills from what we call an emotional toolbox, which I'll say more about in the next slides. So starting with helping your child to understand more about emotions and their emotions, there are three strategies outlined on this slide that may be useful to you. The first is learning about emotions. It may well be essential that you share and label your own emotions, as well as those of characters from TV, films, games, books that your child likes, in order to help them build a picture of what emotions are before you try to support your child to label their own emotions. And there's a really nice film which some of you may have come across called Inside Out, and there's a lovely clip on YouTube, which I've put the link in for you here, which illustrates yeah, how we can learn about emotions and describe them in a very clear and simple way. So another strategy that we have to hold in mind when we're thinking about developing emotional understanding in a children and young person is that we have to tune in or attend to emotions in order to understand them. And again, we might need to start developing this skill by supporting your child to focus on something else. So in this case, focusing their attention on other things, importantly, without judgment. This might be an object, an interest, or pet. If you can teach them that skill to focus on something without judging it, just noticing it, describing it, looking at it, then you can hopefully in the longer run teach them to tune into their own emotions and what's happening in their bodies and minds, and again, labeling it without judgment. Finally, another really good way to help your child learn about emotions is to revisit and reflect on emotions or incidents after they've happened. And again, you might want to consider using the story of emotion framework. Of course, we don't want to do this too soon after an upsetting incident, as we might re-trigger the child. Okay, so I mentioned a couple of slides back about the emotional toolbox of calming skills. And that this slide illustrates the strategies or the categories of strategies that would go into an emotional toolbox. So we have interest-based strategies, so that's things that your child values, enjoys, likes, that are helpful and calming for them. Then we have environmental and physical strategies, so that's things that we can do to the physical environment, and also things that we can do with your child that are physical and reduce stress and dysregulation. We then have sensory and relaxation strategies, social strategies, thinking and attentional strategies, and really importantly, we have a category for unhelpful strategies, because it's really important to label and name those so that they don't continue to be used if they're causing harm unintentionally, of course. So just to say a little bit about interest-based strategies, again, these are activities that will bring joy, comfort, and distraction at times of distress. And there's some simple examples here. So gaming, playing Roblox, animals, stamps, social media, playing football, doing Lego. We really should start with these strategies, because most young people will have things that do something to help them in these moments, and it's often connected to their interests. Sometimes children use these strategies kind of almost all of the time, and that can create problems in itself. So for example, if you're a Roblox lover and that is your strategy for managing your emotions, if you're having a really difficult time, you may end up spending Roblox for hours and hours and hours every day, and of course parents will want that to be reduced. However, we do need to be really careful about reducing use of interest-based strategies until there's an equally effective alternative, because actually if this is your child's sole coping strategy and you take it away, they're going to be left with very little to cope with, and they may suffer even more. Okay, so some examples here of some social strategies, and there's a number of different ways that young people like to be supported. So I've just listed some of them here. So one example would be being with someone who will listen and validate. Another example is being with someone who will give advice, which is obviously very different to being listened to and validated, though they're not mutually exclusive. Another is being with someone who will do something with the person that distracts them, for example, gaming or going for a walk. Another one is being with someone who will check in on the person. So they might not be physically with them all of the time when they're struggling, but they might go away and come back every 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 minutes to check that that's okay. And then another kind of social strategy is actually having someone with you who will stay with you but not say or do anything at all. No questions, no advice, no anything, just that physical presence. And then finally, perhaps this isn't really a social strategy, but it speaks to people's sort of social preferences. Sometimes in these moments of difficulty or distress, being alone, having space is vital. Okay, so Again, some examples here of environmental and physical strategies. So one of the most effective strategies for reducing distress is to remove oneself from overwhelming environments or triggers. And it often brings about a change very quickly. It isn't always a great long-term strategy because unfortunately life is full of stresses and difficult situations. And in the long run, a child or young person may well need to develop some skills and resilience to manage in those situations. However, as a short-term strategy, if it's becoming unsafe or dangerous, supporting a child to move away from the stressful situation or environment is often absolutely essential. A related strategy is around reducing or managing sensory input. So, for example, by providing ear defenders, dimming the lights, closing the curtains. Many young people, when they're becoming dysregulated, benefit from engaging in some kind of vigorous activity. So that's a high energy activity that will burn off some of that stress and adrenaline and so on. Other young people benefit from doing kind of a slower paced, less vigorous kind of form of activity such as yoga. And typically this is helpful when a child is or young person is doing this as a regular practice. This might not be something that they do in the middle of a dysregulated event, but it might be something that they build into their daily lives because that might keep their baseline levels of stress and anxiety at a lower level. Other physical strategies that can be useful and young people have described as useful might connect to their neurodivergence. So things like pacing or stimming. And again, we should always be thinking about what the young person or the child already finds helpful in these situations. We always need to think about whether there's any costs or unintended consequences to those, but actually children and young people often have a range of strategies already, and we may want to draw on those as we build up other strategies. Okay, so moving on to sensory and relaxation strategies. Again, a number of examples here that may be helpful to you and your child. So first, removing oneself from a higher stimulating environment to a lower stimulation space can be really helpful, and you may need to create that space for your child in a part of your home that is more relaxing and calm for them. Another sensory strategy is having a kind of sensory toolkit, so having a range of sensory toys that will bring positive sensory experience and draw kind of focus away from more difficult experiences. A simple strategy that actually doesn't rely on you having anything is the 5-4-3-2-1 strategy. This involves teaching your child to bring their attention to 5 things they can see, 4 things they can touch, 3 things they can hear, 2 things they can smell, and then 1 thing they can taste. This is a really simple grounding or sensory exercise that will bring the attention and focus away from the stresses in the environment to things that are less upsetting or challenging. We also have our classic sort of breathing relaxation strategy. So we might do the 5-5 slow breathing exercise. So we count to 5 as we breathe in, we count to 5 as we breathe out, and teach that to the child. And then we have everyday sensory relaxation strategies. Things like a hand massage can work wonders, in the build up to a more difficult event. It might be enough to connect the child to their body and whoever's offering that hand massage. And then finally, we have an example here of what we call the tip skill. This involves integrating a number of different strategies in sequence. So the first is to try and reduce the child or young person's body temperature using cold water or ice. We need to be quite careful about this because some neurodivergent young people will struggle with the sensation of cold water or ice, but yeah, consider your child's needs and this could be helpful. That's followed by intense exercise. This is a bit like the vigorous activity on the previous slide, ideally for about 15 minutes, followed by some paced breathing. Again, you could do 5-5. I've given the example here of a 5 in, 7 out. again followed by some kind of muscular relaxation exercises. So these are the tensing and relaxing exercises that you can find out about in various online places if you Google progressive muscular relaxation. Okay, so moving on to thinking and attentional strategies. There are a really wide range of thinking and attentional strategies that can be helpful. Some are more complex than others, and again, it will be a trial and error. Some of the simpler strategies are self-validation and mantras and cues. So self-validation kind of strategies are ones in which a child or young person is supported to write down or remember key phrases that will help them in difficult moments. So, for example, this is really hard, but I can do it. I'm going to be okay. It makes sense that I feel like this. Cues are where you prepare a child with an action or lists of actions that they will use in a situation that is difficult for them when they notice themselves becoming dysregulated. And it might be something like get to my safe place, use my feelings thermometer. I'll say a bit more about that in a later slide. Look at my emotional toolbox, let mum know I'm struggling. Slightly more challenging thinking strategies are judging the helpfulness of responses to strong emotions and problem solving. So I mentioned considering the helpfulness of your own thoughts as parents in an earlier slide, but we can also help children and young people to practice this as well. So we might encourage them to ask, is what I'm doing or not doing helping me right now? Is it going to help me in the long run to do what I'm doing now? Problem solving, again, it's a seemingly simple strategy, but actually it's quite complex because you have to consider all of the options available to you, consider what's good and bad about each option, and think which is the best option. But if your child is kind of able to think through this, you're able to support them through it, it can be a really helpful way to give them a sense of control in difficult situations. We also, of course, you can use mindfulness strategies. And for me, mindfulness in its kind of purest form is about paying attention without judgment. So again, using some of those skills to get your child to tune into things in the environment around them, as well as what's going through their minds, what's in their bodies, without judging that, just noticing it and being with it. Again, this is a more complex strategy, and your children or young people may not be ready for it now, but it's worth kind of having that as a possibility for the future. Another strategy, which is perhaps a bit simpler actually than the other ones, is helping your child to see that life and life's challenges can be explored through experiments. So this in its simplest form again involves making predictions about things that the child or young person might be concerned about, and then facing that situation that they're concerned about and measuring whether those predictions are accurate or not. This can really help children gain new information and new ideas about situations that they really struggle in and have typically led to emotional dysregulation. Then a couple more strategies. We've got the stop strategy, which is again seemingly very simple. It involves stopping in moments of stress or difficulty or dysregulation, taking a step back, observing, so that's looking at what's going on, and then moving forward in a mindful way. That's not judging, that's just noticing and acting in a way which is calm and in accordance with your values. Finally, we have wise mind. So this is about paying attention to both what one is feeling, but also trying to integrate kind of thinking alongside that. Because if we rely just on one of those, just on thinking or just on feelings, we're missing a trick really. And we want your child to pay attention to both their feelings and their thoughts, particularly the kind of thoughts and processes which I've illustrated in this slide. Okay, I mentioned earlier on as well about the importance of kind of having a section in the emotional toolbox about unhelpful strategies. So there are a number of examples here. So a classic unhelpful strategy is avoiding and escaping things that actually don't harm the young person. This is slightly more complex for neurodivergent young people because escape and avoidance is sometimes really necessary or important for them. If, for example, they can't manage sensory aspects of the environment or don't have the capacity to manage the demands in a particular context. Another example of an unhelpful strategy would be just relying on one strategy all of the time, because of course if you are not able to use that, you won't have anything else to fall back on. We often see this in terms of children's kind of strong interest or special interest, that's become the go-to strategy for them, and if that's not available to them, then they really struggle. So other unhelpful strategies would be approaching someone in a difficult situation, shouting at them or getting physical with them, hurting oneself, and then finally not sharing worries or concerns with people I trust, so bottling those feelings up. These are just some examples. There are many others, but these might be a good starting point when you're thinking about developing your child and young person's emotional toolbox with them. Okay, so I've shared a number of example strategies with you, and on this slide I just want to start to think with you about how you might identify strategies for your child. So we typically want to kind of identify strategies that might be helpful when your child is at their most calm. So think about places and contexts that they are most settled and calm in. And this particular question might not be the exact one which works for your child, but the principle behind it is important. It's about asking, what can I do to help you next time you're really upset or distressed? Hopefully that will give the beginning of a conversation around this, and you can introduce that there are lots of things in the emotional toolbox, different kinds of strategies that we could work on together to build up a range of things which will be useful. You can, of course, also, if your child is willing to listen and hear these things, share things that you think might be helpful for your child. You can do that in a more cautious or tentative way if your child tends to like to come up with ideas on their own. You also might want to map out with the child the impact of using a calming activity or activities against not using a calming activity or activities. It might help them see that actually they really need something or some things in these moments that they're not currently accessing. One other thing that I think is really important to speak to and isn't directly addressed in the emotional toolbox is that different strategies will work at different points in the emotional dysregulation or different stages of distress. And you might want to develop an a feelings thermometer, which I've illustrated in the slide below. Again, another way to identify strategies is when your child is distressed, you can offer one of these activities and introduce it, and hopefully you'll get a positive effect from it. And then the child goes, yeah, okay, this is something which we can do moving forward. This, as I've mentioned already, this will be a bit of a trial and error approach, because if it was as simple as there being a textbook which tells you what to do with your child, it would be easy, but actually it will be about developing a sort of idiosyncratic selection of strategies that work for you and work for them. And finally, we might need to change or rotate the calming activities. Sometimes they sort of lose their effectiveness when they've been used for a while, or a child loses faith in it. And so we might need to move to something else or some other things, and then come back to a strategy which has helped in the past, in the future. Okay, so here's an example of a simple completed emotional toolbox. So for this young person, the interest-based strategy is playing Roblox. The environmental physical strategies is using their punch bag. The sensory relaxation strategy is a breathing exercise called soothing rhythm breathing. The social strategy is just sitting with their mum, and the thinking strategy is reminding themselves that they can do this. The unhelpful strategy, something that they've done in the past, but they've identified as less helpful now, is biting their arm. Okay, so here we have the feelings thermometer. So for this young person, they've identified 5 different levels of anger. When they're slightly angry, there's a range of strategies which work really well, but probably wouldn't work very well when they were very angry or red hot angry. So for slightly angry, being distracted with silly jokes, reminding themselves what happened last time they got angry, and reading is helpful. When they're quite angry, breathing exercises and sitting with their mum is helpful. When they're angry, the tensing, relaxing exercises, fiddle toys, chewing gum and Minecraft works well for them. When they're very angry, they need to get out of the situation, go to their bedroom, put their headphones in, put some music on and play Minecraft. And when they're red hot angry, that's the most angry they get, they need to again get out of the situation, go to their bedroom, punch pillows and yell. So you might want to think about developing something like this with your own child or young person to help them think about what's needed at different levels of dysregulation or distress. Okay. Just a quick mention about rewards. You will almost certainly need to use rewards to build new skills with your young person. They'll need reward and encouragement to even try new skills and to practice them, and of course to try them in real life situations. And we want to reward the use of them in situations, even if it doesn't necessarily lead to the desired effect, because it's the practice that's going to bring about change. Of course, if a child does use a new calming skill and it really helps to calm them, that should be naturally reinforced because it's got that positive effect of making them feel better. But initially, it may well need some additional external reinforcement. So that doesn't have to be something big. It can be a small reward, but it should be provided as soon after they've practiced or used the new skill as possible. And this is really obvious, but something's only a reward if the person experiences it as rewarding. So you're going to need to identify what it is that is a rewarding thing for your child. Finally here, you might need to keep providing the reward for some time after your child starts practicing or using the new skill in order to keep it going, but the aim should be to gradually reduce use of the reward over time, particularly as it should become self-reinforcing because it has the desired effect in terms of helping them to not become dysregulated. Okay, so in summary, emotional dysregulation is absolutely not your or your child's fault, but it has a huge impact on you both. You will have created a vision and goals for what you want to achieve for you and your child in terms of emotional regulation. We thought about the story of emotion as a helpful way to understand emotional dysregulation and to continue to understand it, to keep coming back to that. Children and young people with potential autism and ADHD are much more likely to experience problems with emotional regulation because of brain, social, learning, soothing and sensory differences, and differences recognising and understanding emotions. We've also thought through parent skills and child skills that can help with emotional dysregulation. There are two parts of the parent skills. The first is ways to calm your child as quickly as possible when they're dysregulated. The second is to develop skills that will prevent emotional dysregulation and help your child manage dysregulation. And for your child, there's again two aspects. The first is improving their ability to recognise and understand their emotions, and the second is supporting them to develop this emotional toolbox of calming activities. I really hope there's a lot that you take away from this, but for me there are two key messages really. The first is validate your child's emotions and your own emotions for that matter as well. They are equally important, and actually if you really tune into them and understand them, that will go a long way to bring about change. And the other element is practice. This is one of life's greatest challenges, and you and your child will need to practice these skills over and over again. Doing that will give you the best chance of bringing about change. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So finally, things to consider and actions before the question and answer session. We'd really encourage you just before the question and answer session to revisit your goals. After today's session, identify the things that you want to take from this video and the things that you want to do. Again, practice and get your child practicing as much as possible. And then finally, please make a note of any questions or comments you have before the Q&A. There are also some resources here that you might want to have a look at. There's the Harvey and Penzo book that I've mentioned a couple of times during the video. There's also a lovely workbook created by an autistic adult with lived experience of emotional dysregulation, which would be of interest to some of you, I'm sure. And then finally, there's a really good short film about mental health and neurodiversity that Oxford Health have made. The link is here. Thank you so much for listening, and I really look forward to seeing you all at the question and answer session. Thank you.